I've been running a solo business for years, and for most of that time, I felt like I was constantly chasing an invisible goal. Yes, I knew what my financial target was. I knew the end goal that I wanted, but I didn't have the milestone trackers to know if I was moving in the right direction. And even if I did set some milestone trackers, I would always forget to consistently monitor my numbers. And so this video is about the system that I started running once a month that changed how I see the business entirely. And so if you run a solo operation, a side business, or anything where you're the only one responsible to the goal, this one's for you. By the way, if you're new here, my name's Hazel June, and I spent years working with experts designing online programs, creating learning resources, and building AI tools. Right now, I build AI systems for business owners who are buried in their business so they can get their time back, get more things done, and grow their business without hiring a team. Now, I want to start by naming something that I think happens to most solo operators and or solo business owners. You have a goal and then you've probably have it written down somewhere. Maybe you shared it publicly, or maybe you told a friend, or maybe you just have a number in your head. And then you also have activities. You're working, you're busy, you're doing the things. But here's the question I want to sit with for a second. Do you actually know if you're on track? Not whether you worked hard, but whether what you're doing right now is actually moving you toward the thing you said you wanted. Because here's what most of us do instead of knowing. We check a revenue number, and if it's good, we feel good, right? If it's low, we panic, and then we either push harder or we spiral. And, that could work. But the thing is, revenue is a result, it's an outcome. And one thing I learned when I was doing leadership training in corporate is that behaviors drive results. So instead of committing to a result, we have to commit to the behaviors that drive that specific result. Because if you think about it, we have no control over the results, but we sure as hell have control over our own actions. In other words, result is the output, behaviors are the inputs. So to get an output, we need to know exactly what inputs are needed. Think about it. If you're only looking at revenue, which is a result, by the time about revenue month shows up, the thing that caused it happened 30, 60, 90 days before. So we're actually looking at the score of a game that already happened or that already ended. And here's what most of us don't do, myself included. We don't watch the game tape. We don't reflect and process the things we did that contributed to the result or the outcome. Yes, we can't fix yesterday, but if we knew specifically, precisely which one input or action in our system was underperforming or was underutilized, or not optimized, we would know exactly where to put our energy. And so that's what a monthly solo board meeting does. And that's what I want to talk about today. Now, I want to be clear about this concept of running a board meeting. This is not a corporate ritual for companies with teams and conference rooms and VP of sales presenting slides. As you know, I run my business solo. I don't have a team. For most of the years, I never had a structure that made me look at the full picture of my business health. A solo board meeting is exactly what it sounds like. You sit down once a month and you run a structured diagnostic on your business. You look at real numbers, you allot time for reflection, and you make a real decision about what comes next. There is no one to impress because you're literally just looking at your business, just you and the data. And I know sometimes looking at your data is a little bit uncomfortable, but that is actually the whole point. Running the board meeting doesn't make the numbers worse. It gives you visibility on where you're currently at, not what the curated IG Reel version or the polished Media Kit version, but the raw, stripped down version of where you're actually at. And that visibility is important because it gives you direction on what to do next. So let's dive in. Now, the first step is your month to date scorecard. For me, that means revenue, pipeline stages, outreach activity, list size, and partnership metrics. Yours will probably be different. So, whatever your business actually runs on, you pull the real numbers. And the rule here, the one that I have to enforce on myself every single month, is to not involve feelings or add comments on the data. Just get the raw numbers. Because if we're going to be honest, before we actually pull the data, we already have assumptions in our head, right? We would start explaining to ourselves and making a case about what the data could look like. We would say, we might think, the numbers suck this month because I had a lot going on, or it was lower this month because the narrative, like the narrative shows up before the data is even in the room. And the narrative is almost always self protective. And so the month to date scorecard has one job, it's to stop the narrative before it even starts. In this step of the process, AI scanned my workspace and the applicable files to pull those numbers. So I'm presented by the data before I even got the chance to come up with a narrative. Now, let's talk about step two. Step two is where most people stop doing their review because this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. This is the PTG check or the progress to goal check. When I was in corporate, one of the metrics that managers always look at is what they call the PTG or percent to goal, meaning how far are we from the goal? So, for example, if the sales goal is $10,000 by the end of the month and we're currently at $5,000, that means we're 50% to the goal. So if you think about it, it's not, am I making progress? It's the actual math, it's an actual number. And so if you kept going at exactly this pace, not the pace that you planned, but the actual pace, what number do you land by year end? And that's a pretty interesting data because then you'll be able to really move at a pace that is realistic for you. Let me show you what this looked like for me in May. 41% of the year was gone. High ticket revenue, zero. Annual run rate at that pace, also zero. And so to hit my annual target, I would need $5,000 in revenue every single week for the rest of the year, not by December, but by the following week, every single week until December. Think about that level of specificity. That level of granularity and objective math is what you need so that you get clear direction on where you actually need to focus on. That also prompts you to ask a very important question, which is, for the math to make sense, I need X to achieve Y. Is it realistic? And yet another important question, which I've learned from Tom Bilyeu, is no bullshit. What would it take? And that's incredibly helpful because some of us keep our goal fuzzy. And I used to do this too. I would be clear on my end goal, no question. But I didn't have the level of granularity or specificity to make it really actionable and insightful for me. So why do we tend to do that? Well, a fuzzy gap doesn't hurt as much. Step two, which is the PTG, progress to goal, that data makes it sharp on purpose because you can only close a gap you're willing to look at. By the way, if you want to get the full workflow so you can start running your own end of month board meeting, check out the link in the description. All right, let's head over to step three. Now, step three is what I call the business health score. And this is probably the step that I would argue matters the most because it forces you to see the shape of your business, not just the revenue line. Now, I was inspired to add this step in my monthly board meeting because when I was working with AT&T, I noticed that every customer account has a health score. And it's basically a number assigned to an account based on how likely they're going to churn, how much money they're paying, and so on and so forth. And I thought it's a great idea to measure the overall health of my business too. Now, in my case, I rate myself across 5 different core functions: revenue and profitability, pipeline and conversion, lead generation, audience and content, and then goal progress. 5 functions, one honest rating for each one, and then a composite score out of 25. Now, obviously, yours might look different depending on your business or revenue model. But here's why the composite score matters more than any individual rating. What's easy to explain away in isolation becomes hard to ignore when it's sitting next to 4 other scores. A 2 out of 5 in pipeline conversion is okay, I'm working on it. But a 2 out of 5 in 3 different categories is is a structure problem, not just a bad month. But that business health gives me that insight so I know what to focus on. All right, step 4 is stop, start, continue, which is another concept that I've learned when I was doing leadership training in corporate. During coaching sessions, leaders are encouraged to ask their direct report 3 questions to get their commitment. What will you stop doing? What will you start doing? And what will you continue doing? So if you use that 3 question framework from a data tracking lens, you're going to ask yourself, what do the numbers tell me to stop doing? What do they tell me to start? And what's working that I should protect? The keyword in all 3 sections is tell, not what do I feel like stopping, not what sounds like a good idea to start, but what does the data actually tell you? This is where steps 1 through 3 really pay off, because now you're not just making decisions from feeling, you're actually making decisions from actual data. So for me, these are my stop, start, continue commitments. But let's be real. Most people would consider this kind of reflection as journaling. But if you really think about it, it's not really journaling, isn't it? Because this phase is where you make the insights you learned from the previous steps actionable. And if you skip it, the review was just data entry. Now let's talk about step 5, which is what closes the meeting. And this is where we identify the next month's priorities. 3 specific priorities that directly address what the data surfaced. Because here's the trap. Most people would end their monthly review with more clarity than they started, but they don't have any plan on what to do with it. They would know more about the business than they did an hour ago, but then they would go back to their day-to-day routine. And I'm guilty of that too, which is why I added this step in the meeting workflow. Step 5 forces you to translate everything: the scorecard, the business health score, the stop, start, continue. Translate those into 3 concrete actions that are tied to the actual gap that the data exposed. Now, this is super helpful because when you know what your priorities are, it would be easier to filter the noise. By the way, all of this was done through my AI operating system. Now, let's close the loop on what I said at the start. Because remember when I said that in the past, even though I knew exactly what my financial goal is, I always felt like I was chasing an invisible goal. An invisible goal is what happens when you have a number you're working toward, but you don't have real visibility on whether your current behavior is actually producing it. You can work extremely hard, sending pitches, doing client work, posting content, all the things, and you'll still be completely off course because you're either measuring the wrong things or not measuring at all. What this entire workflow does is to make the goal visible, not just by checking revenue, but by actually checking the leading indicators, the inputs that actually produce the results. And when one of them breaks, you can see it in the scorecard before you feel it in your bank account. And when you can see it, you can fix it before it compounds. Now, I run this in my AI operating system as a structured command that walks me through every step, pulls my current context, and surfaces the diagnosis. The AI runs the whole meeting with me. I still do the reflection and I still make the decisions, but the structure is built into the system. That way, I can't skip it when I don't feel like looking at the numbers. Now, if you want to run your own solo board meeting, make sure to check the link in the description so you get a copy of the whole workflow. Now, if you want to go deeper on these types of AI systems that I built for myself and my business, And even the bills that I do for clients, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I drop a new video every week where I talk about AI systems, what I'm working on, and the things that I'm learning working with seven figure clients. See you in my next video. Ciao.